Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Great to be here.
Today, we're heading off, metaphorically speaking, to a really fascinating place, an island nation in the Indian Ocean.
Right, sitting there between Madagascar and Mozambique, the Comoros.
Exactly, and you picture these, stunning islands, rich culture, but there are these surprising global links, too, like ylang-ylang for Chanel perfume comes from there.
Yeah, that's one of the big ones.
So our mission today with this deep dive is to pull out the key insights, the really fascinating bits from the material you've shared.
Kind of a shortcut, yeah, to get a handle on this complex place.
That's the idea. We'll go through the geography, the culture, touch on the turbulent history, colonial stuff, politics.
And then look at where things stand now, the challenges, the future. We'll try and connect those dots.
Okay, sounds good. Let's dive in. Where do we start? The archipelago itself.
Yeah, let's get a picture of the islands. People talk about the Four Sisters.
Ah, yes, Grande Comore.
Ngazija, that's its Comorian name. The Moheli, or Moali. Anjouan, which is Nzouani. And the fourth one, Mayotte.
Right. And the sources really stress how different they are, even though they're so close.
Totally. Anjouan is described as, lively, maybe a bit chaotic, especially the capital there.
Compared to Moheli, which sounds much more serene. Laid back.
Exactly. Very quiet, smaller. And then Grande Comore, where the capital Moroni is, it's sort of a mix of the two.
A blend. Interesting. And geographically, they're volcanic, right? That's
absolutely key. It shapes the whole landscape. Grande Comore and Anjouan have these steep, rugged mountains, really dramatic terrain.
high relief, the sources called it.
Yeah, big changes in altitude. But Moheli's different. It's the smallest, flatter, got those white sand beaches, a barrier reef.
Sounds idyllic, but the volcanic origin means tough terrain overall.
Steep slopes, yeah. Not always easy to get around or farm.
And this leads to the economy. The perfumed islands nickname? Agriculture was pretty much all there was before spices took off.
That's right. And now Comoros is, like you mentioned, huge in vanilla, the world's biggest supplier.
Right.
Plus cardamom, especially in Anjouan's hills.
Yeah.
And ylang-ylang, of course, on
Grande Comore.
for the perfume essence.
Exactly. They also export sea cucumber and cloves. It's a narrow base, really.
And culturally, it sounds incredibly mixed.
Oh, absolutely. You see that history of migration and trade. Around Moroni, you've got Malayo-Polynesian villages, Gabonese Bantu villages.
Reflecting influences from Southeast Asia, Africa.
The Arab world, Persia, India, it's all woven together. The language itself, Comorian, is a Swahili dialect, but with tons of French loanwords.
And Creole, too.
Creole spoken as well, yeah.
Yeah.
There's this Comorian proverb, untold stories are stories untold.
What does that get at?
It suggests this real importance placed on documenting history, maybe because so much of it, especially on Grande Comore, wasn't really written down until the mid-20th century. It was oral.
Okay. So beautiful islands, rich culture, perfume. But there's a flip side.
A big one. It's still a poor developing country. High unemployment, not many opportunities, especially for young people in rural areas. That feels like a crucial piece of context for everything else.
It really is. And to understand why things are the way they are, you have to look back at the history.
The layers of settlement.
Yeah. Evidence suggests Pygmies first, then Bantu people, probably from East Africa.
Okay.
Then from the 7th century or so, merchants start arriving, Arabs, Indians, Persians. By the 10th century, you've got Arab or Shirazi sultans setting up rule.
And then the Europeans arrived. The Portuguese were early 16th century.
Early 16th, yeah. The sources say they observed a local slave trade already happening.
Right, and they tried to dominate, even called them the Seychelles Islands.
They did for a bit, but their influence kind of faded by the mid-1600s.
Which opened the door for France.
For France. They acquired Mayotte first in 1841.
Okay.
Then later, in 1886, protectorate status over Anjouan and Moheli. By 1909, they're formally incorporated into France, and it becomes a full colony by 1947.
And this colonial period, especially the 19th century, the material paints a grim picture. The slave trade was massive in the Indian Ocean then.
Huge. And these weren't just minor skirmishes. They called them colonial wars that essentially wiped out the existing political culture.
Liquidating centuries of indigenous political culture was the phrase used. That's devastating.
Yeah. Imagine your whole system of leadership just dismantled. It led to this saying, apparently, Comoros isn't a country, it's a graveyard.
Gosh, that really tells you something.
So, understandably, after World War II, the push for independence started growing.
Fueled by nationalists, but also Comorian soldiers who fought for France.
Exactly. They served in both world wars, formed a significant diaspora in France. Something like 200,000 Comorians live there now.
So there was even a timetable agreed for independence, mid-1976.
There was. But then things went sideways.
This is the part about the deaths.
Yeah, really suspicious timing. The Comorian president, Said Mohamed Cheikh, died in a car crash.
Oh.
And just 3 months later, the French president, Georges Pompidou, also died.
Wow. And that derailed the agreed plan.
Completely derailed it. It led to a much more chaotic break.
Oh.
Well, Abdallah Abdurrahman just went ahead and proclaimed independence unilaterally, July 6th, 1975.
Just declared it.
Yep. And suddenly you have this new Comorian union, but it doesn't even have a flag, an anthem, a currency. Nothing was ready.
And crucially, Mayotte didn't join.
Mayotte voted to stay French. And that decision, right there, is called the starting point of political instability.
You can see why. A nation divided from day one.
And Islam was declared compulsory soon after that unilateral independence, too.
So, okay, independence declared, but Mayotte's out and things are already shaky. What happens immediately after?
Chaos, pretty much. Just 2 days later, July 8th, Anjouan and Moheli declare their independence from Comoros.
Wow, breaking away from the breakaway state.
Exactly. The new union couldn't control them. It just fragmented instantly.
And the instability. The numbers are just staggering.
They really are. The sources mention over 25 coup attempts in the dozen or so years following independence.
25.
And more than 21 coup or attempts overall, the average government lifespan, less than 6 months.
Less than 6 months. How can anything get done?
It's incredibly difficult. Most former leaders end up exiled, jailed, or assassinated.
Which led to that grim nickname for the president.
The president of the house in the sun. Basically, a very temporary, very exposed position.
It paints such a picture of constant turmoil, just living through that.
Yeah.
The uncertainty.
And it didn't stop there. More separatist movements. There was a big uprising in Anjouan in August 97.
Right.
That led to complex negotiations. Eventually, the Fomboni Declaration in 2001.
What was the aim of that?
Trying to rebuild democratic institutions, reunify the country. The peaceful election in 2006 was seen as a positive step, a bit of progress.
But alongside the political chaos, there were economic issues, right? Attempts at reform that backfired.
Yeah, that's a really insightful point from the material. In the early 90s, they had some debt written off, which sounds good. But at the same time, international aid just plummeted, went from over $100 million down to less than $20 million in just 6 years.
Ouch. So the debt relief didn't really help.
Because so much of the remaining budget then had to go just to servicing the rest of the debt. It choked off public spending.
A classic debt trap, almost worsened by the aid drop.
Kind of. And you see the impact on daily life. Food prices, especially rice, the staple, shot up. There were riots.
People couldn't afford to eat.
Pretty much. Plus, that shift from subsistence farming to cash crops like vanilla makes them more vulnerable to global price swings. And water scarcity is a huge issue, too, with droughts.
And how did all this affect basic services like healthcare and education?
They've been under massive strain. Even at independence, healthcare access was unequal better in cities.
Okay.
Then those structural adjustment programs in the 90s, the ones tied to aid and loans, they forced cuts.
Cuts to health and education.
Yep. Which meant user fees came in, you had to pay for services, and the quality generally went down.
And education.
Similar problems. High costs, not enough school buildings, plus the laws are written in French, but most people speak Comorian.
Creating a huge literacy gap if the laws aren't even in your language.
Exactly. It leaves a large part of the population effectively illiterate in the language of governance.
Wow. And there was that weird anecdote about Coca-Cola.
Oh, yeah, that was strange. From the colonial era, apparently the drink was diluted for locals.
Has strength.
But double strength for officials.
Oh, way.
And rejected bottles were sometimes used for washing floors or making mosaics.
That's bizarre. It says so much about the inequality, even in something like soft drinks. And a milk factory got turned into a cola plant.
Seems like it. A strange footnote, but revealing.
So, okay, we've got this history of instability, economic hardship, social challenges. Where does that leave Comoros looking forward? Migration seems like a big factor.
Huge. The stat was 1 Comorian in 4 lives outside the country.
1 in 4. Where do they go?
Historically, there's always been movement, but post-independence, Mayotte is a big draw because it's French, a gateway to Europe.
Right.
And mainland France itself, of course, given the history and the diaspora. A lot of this migration is unofficial, hard to track accurately.
Makes sense. And environmentally, they're in a tough spot too.
Very much so. Highly vulnerable to climate change impacts. Cyclones, droughts, landslides are all risks.
And sea level rise.
Yeah, especially threatening Western Anjouan, apparently. Plus, you've got high population density putting pressure on resources.
Leading to deforestation, soil erosion.
All those connected problems. But on the plus side, they do have unique biodiversity. Endangered species. There's potential for ecotourism if managed carefully.
Potential, but fragile. So what about plans to actually develop the economy, build infrastructure?
There are plans. They recognize the need to tackle the lack of infrastructure, the unskilled workforce, the narrow resource base.
But the political instability always gets in the way.
That's been the recurring problem. It undermines any long-term planning. Initiatives like Fomboni, the 2006 election, those were attempts to build stability, create a foundation.
And France's role continues to be significant.
Definitely. Through Mayotte, and also direct aid money, administrative help, the sources note that despite all the history and maybe some prejudice, this French support is actually seen as a source of stability.
Interesting dependency, perhaps.
It's complex, but overall, the future looks uncertain. There are untapped resources, minerals, fishing.
But also international indifference, as one source put it.
Yeah, and this interesting phrase, the threat of a post-extractive void of culture.
Meaning?
Like if they just focus on extracting resources without building a strong, sustainable sense of identity and purpose alongside it, they risk losing something vital.
Wow. So wrapping this up, it's been quite a journey through Comoros. Incredible beauty, deep culture.
Absolutely. But running right alongside that, this history of turmoil, colonial legacies, persistent instability, economic struggle.
It really is a paradox, isn't it? This vibrant society trying to hold itself together amidst constant upheaval.
But there's resilience there, too. The hope mentioned is that this multicultural, diverse population can learn from the past, get beyond the identity politics.
Which leaves us, and you listening, with something to think about.
Yeah. In our connected world, what responsibility do outside powers, the global community, have for nations like Comoros, especially when their history is so tangled up with external influences?
And maybe even more fundamentally, how does a nation build a stable future when its very identity, its sovereignty, feels constantly tested from inside and out?